Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study. I'm playing the simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in Zechariah chapter 14, and we're doing a little excursion because we're talking about the second coming of Jesus. And we're doing this excursion because we're asking the question, where is the church in Bible prophecy? The book of Zechariah I like to refer to as the Old Testament version of the book of Revelation because it is filled with revelation of end times. And also we have a vivid picture of the second coming of Jesus when he will return and then what he will do when he returns. So that's important in terms of understanding end times, better known as eschatology, which is the study of end times. So in the Old Testament, excuse me, there is a continuity of revelation as far as the prophetic is concerned. In the Old Testament, the primary focus on Jesus, the second coming, and then the what he will do when he comes, and then also the restoration of Israel, his setting up his kingdom. Okay, so the big question becomes, then where is the church in this prophetic scheme? And that's what I want to explore. Okay, so Zechariah starts off in the chapter 14, which is the last chapter of Zechariah. But it starts off by talking about the day of the Lord. Now, just by way of refresher, remember this prophetic picture. We're studying this. We're going to go back to it in a moment. This is it is a prophetic picture given to Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 2, which tells us the human, it's a human form representing the world dominating kingdoms from Nebuchadnezzar until the second coming of Jesus Christ. So and then all prophecy centers around this. We're in Daniel chapter 9 when it talks about the 70 weeks. Excuse me. And I think this is important. Let me share my screen and bring it up. So excuse me. Well, let me come back. Now I want to do a little background before I get into this again. When we talk about where the church fits into this prophecy, the prophetic scheme, whether it's Matthew 24, even the book of Revelation. So where does the church fit in that? That's what I want to deal with. And then that will end when we talk about the church age. Where is this church age at in Scripture? And I want to get into that. But we first have to understand what leads up to that period of time, which then will end with what's called the rapture of the church. Now, the rapture of the church is oftentimes confused with the second coming, and is certainly debated. That's what the whole controversy is. Some people see the rapture of the church, and some people see the rapture of the church and the second coming as the same event. It is not. There are three commonly held views where the rapture of the church, okay, is concerned. The second coming of Jesus is when Jesus will come back. We read that in Zechariah chapter 1, right? His feet will touch down on the Mount of Olives. Okay, so his feet will touch down on the Mount of Olives. And so when his feet touch down, he will set up his kingdom. We call it the 1,000-year reign of Christ. Now that's crystal clear in Scripture. What is not crystal clear is the rapture, Jesus coming back from the church. Now, the word rapture doesn't appear in Scripture, and some people take issue with that. We can say catching away. But the rapture of the church is when Jesus will come and remove his church from the earth. The controversy centers around what we call the day of the Lord or the Great Tribulation period. There are three commonly held views on when the rapture will happen. There is what I hold to, it's the pre-tribulation or Great Tribulation rapture, in which Jesus will remove the church before the tribulation period began. There are those that believe that the church will go halfway through the Great Tribulation period and then be raptured. And then there are those that believe the church will go all the way through the tribulation period and then be raptured. One thing about that, none of the views, including my own, could produce a clearly stated verse that says when the rapture will happen. So I don't have a verse that says that the rapture will happen before the tribulation period. There's not a verse that says that the rapture will happen in the middle of the tribulation period or at the end of the tribulation period. So with that, we can debate on it, we can dialogue on it, and at the very least, agree to disagree. You'd be surprised, people get really, really ugly and ungodly in holding to their positions. Now, unlike the second coming, which is clearly stated, we even open it up in in Zechariah 14. He clearly states Jesus will come, his feet will set down on the Mount of Olives. The rapture of the church is clearly stated, but just not when. And we'll get to that in a moment, because I want to let us have an understanding of that. So I'm going to go, let's share my screen here. So we were talking about Daniel's 70 weeks. And again, verse 24 says, 70 weeks are decreed upon your people in your holy city to bring about a rebellion, to bring rebellion to an end, to put a stop to sin, to wipe away iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and anoint the most holy place. Now, I also say prophecy is simple, but you have to pay attention to the details, okay? You have to pay attention to the details. Here's the detail. So the 70-week prophecy is about Israel. That's important. Keep that in mind. It's about Israel, Jerusalem, and the temple. Verse 25 says, "No one understands this from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince, will be 7 weeks." Now, these 70 weeks, or 1 week, equals a 7-year period. So 70 sets of 7-year periods of time. He says that from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Now, we read this in the last study when we went to the book of Ezra. In fact, we have it still here. I have it here when it says, in the first year of Cyrus the king, the word of the Lord spoken through Jeremiah was fulfilled. Now, this is very interesting because you have this back in Daniel at the very first verse. It said in the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, a Mede by birth, who was ruler over the kingdom of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the books, according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet, that the number of the years for the desolation of Jerusalem would be 70. Jeremiah had prophesied that Israel's exile, remember the judgment, Nebuchadnezzar come in and he destroys the city. He exiles the people. In fact, Daniel himself is in exile. He was deported to Babylon. But this exile would only last 70 years. Daniel is reading and saying, the 70 years is up. Okay? The 70 years is up. So now, when he receives this prophecy, he begins to pray. God sends an angel and gives him this prophecy. 70 weeks are decreed. And then he says, know and understand it from the issuing of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Well, in Ezra, when King Cyrus issued the decree, it started a prophetic countdown. Okay? He says, from the issue of the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. We saw that in Ezra. And then he says, until Messiah the Prince will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks or 69 weeks. Then he says it will be rebuilt with the plaza and a moat, but in difficult times. After those 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off. So right here, a vivid prophecy from King Darius of the Medes, which, by the way, was the second kingdom we saw in that image, right? That he says, so right here, we have a timeline, 69 weeks, Jesus is cut off. If you're Peter and the apostles, you could chart yourself in this prophecy. Right now, we're at week 69. Then he says something, he switches thought here. I actually think that the verse 27 should begin here. And remember, verses and chapter headings are not inspired at all. But then he says, the people of the coming prince will destroy the city. The sanctuary will end with the flood. Or the end will come with the flood until the end will be war and desolations are decreed. Now, some people see this as AD 70. And while I could say this could be a near fulfillment, but not the ultimate fulfillment, he says, verse 27, he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to the sacrifice and offerings and the abomination of desolation. Keep that phrase in mind. The abomination of desolation will be on the wing of the temple until the decreed destruction is poured out on the desolator. So notice right here, the last week, the 70th week, he makes a firm covenant for 1 week. In the middle of the week, right, he puts a stop to the sacrifice, and then we have the abomination that makes desolate. Now keep this in mind. We're going to go to Matthew 24. Matthew 24. And here Jesus is talking about the end of the age. So Matthew 24. Now, I'm going to start in chapter 23, verse 37 says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. By the way, this chapter where Jesus gives a scathing rebuke of the Pharisees. And he ends it by saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, she who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen who gathers her chicks under her wings, yet you were not willing. He says, see, your house is left to you desolate, for I tell you, you will never see me again until you say, he who comes in the name of the Lord is the blessed one. So this is Jesus' last words to Jerusalem, okay? Because to date, they have not said, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Not even in 1947. Now, a lot of people see 1947 when Israel became a nation as a fulfillment of prophecy. I do not see that as a fulfillment of prophecy. Because they have not said, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Okay? Now he comes in verse 24, he says, as Jesus left and was going out of the temple complex, his disciples came up and called his attention to the temple buildings. Then he replied to them, don't you see all these things? I assure you, not one stone will be left here on another that will not be thrown down. Now, for sure, this was fulfilled in AD 70. Verse 3, it was fulfilled in AD 70 when Titus, the Roman general, went into Jerusalem and leveled the city. Verse 3, while he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, his disciples approached him privately and said, tell us, when will these things happen? And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So this is what this chapter is about. This is why this is what he's getting ready to say. Okay. But now something interesting though. So let's stop for a moment. So who's asking the question? And that's important to understand. Who's asking the question? So there's a couple of things about the answer. One, his disciples. Actually, it's more. Three things. I'm going to say three things. One, his disciples. Two, his Jewish disciples. So that's important. His disciples, and then his Jewish disciples, and then instruction that would be going on past the time of the apostles. So he first says in verse 4, then Jesus replied to them. Now, remember, he's going to answer three questions. Tell us, when will these things happen? What is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? So when he says, when will these things happen? Well, what things? The destruction of the temple. So the answer is going to be during the time of the church. Even though the church here is not mentioned by name, his address to the disciples who are the believers is addressed. Okay. So he says, Jesus replied to them, watch out that no one deceives you, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many. You are going to hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, because these things must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nations, and kingdoms against kingdoms. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these events are the beginning of birth pains. Now it's kind of interesting because every time there's a great disaster someplace, people always say, well, the Bible talks about the end times. Well, he actually said that they are the beginning of birth pains, right? And he says the end is not yet. Anyway, verse 9, then they will hand you over for persecution, and they will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Then many will take offense and betray one another and hate one anher. And many false prophets will arise and deceive many, because lawlessness will multiply. The love of many will grow cold, but one who endures to the end will be delivered. Now, if you're reading the King James, it says saved. And the word saved means delivered. Okay? So it's not talking about making it to heaven, earning your way to heaven. So he's talking about enduring the trials, the persecutions, you will be delivered. Verse 14, this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed in all the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to go on and read now, because remember when I told you in Daniel there was a switch in thought? Well, here is another switch in thought. But I want to read this for continuity, what we just read in Daniel. Verse 15 says, so when you see the abomination that causes desolation, spoken by the prophet Daniel, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. We just read that, right? In Daniel, the 70 weeks, right? We just read that. He also talked about that, this very abomination that makes desolation, right? The stopping of the daily sacrifice. He's also talked about it in chapter 7 and chapter 8. But watch what he said. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. A man on the housetop must not come down to get his things out of the house, and the man in the field must not go back to get his clothes. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days. Pray that your escape may not be in the winter, but on the Sabbath. For at the time there will be great tribulation, the kind that hasn't taken place from the beginning of the world until now, and never will again. Unless those days were limited, no one would survive, but those days will be limited because of the elect. Now, I want to unpack this. I'm going to stop here because I'm going to come back and unpack this. Who is he talking about? And is the elect the church here? Let's unpack this. But I'm going to do it in the next study because I'm out of time. So don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP The Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. And I will see you in the next study.